Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at deborahrrichardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the annual plan and also to download a training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. So the U.S., at the time this podcast is being published, which is the first week of March 2022, the U.S. is still in the throes of what is being called the Great Resignation. And now COVID restrictions are being lifted, which means that many more of you are going back to the office. Now, if you are one of the ones where you're adding back that commute on top of absorbing work from that employee or employees that left before the next one is hired, for you and your team members, I have some tips that may help. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 177, 12 tips to add efficiency as vendor team members leave your organization. Now, I am sure everyone is happy, finally, almost 2 years, right? 2 full years, 24 whole months, because for me, it started in March of 2022. And now, as of March 2022 and definitely by April 2022, a lot of the COVID restrictions that we've been dealing with are now lifted. And so many more of you have the opportunity to go back into the office. Matter of fact, your companies are requiring you to go back into the office, if not full-time, but then at least on a hybrid schedule. And so combine that with the fact that we're still in what's considered the Great Resignation, which has really hit the accounts payable team kind of hard because we don't typically have high wages in this area in the first place. And now, because everyone else is being hit with the Great Resignation and they're scrambling for the same workers that accounts payable are, they're in a bit of a better position because they can respond to the Great Resignation and the pressure to increase rates, their starting rates, hourly wages, salaries in order to get these people in the door. And they're doing just that. Whereas accounts payable does not always have that option to raise those salaries. And so we're dealing with one, trying to retain our employees, and two, those that do leave, having a difficult time to replace them. And so today, I thought it was a great time to talk about 12 ways you can add in efficiencies to make up for the vendor team members that have left until you can get someone else, or maybe you can put some of these things in place to as a permanent fix, maybe not. And I do want to just say here, I am not going to be talking about automation because I know that implementing a vendor self-registration portal is a project which is going to push your day job, especially if you're in management. It's going to push your day job to your night job. So I'm going to focus more here on processes and policy changes that you can put into place to reduce that extra work caused by vendor team members that have resigned or that have left. All right, so I have broken these 12 tips down into three different areas. So I have policy tips, I have vendor process tips, and then I also have vendor team member tips. So let's get started with policy tips. All right, so the first one is a vendor policy. Now, if you don't have one, you need to get one. And if your vendor policy is that one little paragraph inside of your accounts payable policy, you need to expand that. Your vendor policy needs to tell your internal team members how to do business with AP. It needs to include instructions for how to set up a new vendor, how to change an existing vendor, and what documents are required, how they need to submit it, everything they need in order to set that vendor up so that you have support for when your team members require it. And that way you don't have to go back and forth with an internal team member getting on their case because they are asking for something that the internal team member doesn't understand why. You have a vendor policy that is signed by leadership, and so that is the support for your vendor team member. And then two, it just may eliminate that phone call to your team members or your department about how do I set up a new vendor or how do I change an existing vendor because it is in the vendor policy. All right, so that was tip number one. Tip number two is also related to your vendor policy. And within your vendor policy, you need to have a service level agreement or SLA that tells the internal team members how long it's going to take, what your turnaround time is for vendor requests. Now, obviously, you don't want to, if you're short on staff, you can, work overtime or work your staff overtime, or you can work overtime. But guess what? That's going to increase the burnout for your team members. And how long can that really go on? And we see that at year end when we get those increased requests coming because, increased invoice volumes are coming out. The only reason that really worked, at least that in my experience, is because it was for a short period of time. So if it's going to be a short period of time, that may work. But think about the fact that they've had hardships and increased work like all through the pandemic. It's not as if they're coming in fresh, and this is just a, year-end type thing. No, they've been really stressed in what they're doing for the past really 24 months. And so they're probably already at the point where, they may not want, you may have situations where you don't want overtime or they don't want overtime. They already may feel burnout. And so to help with that, increase your SLA. So was it 48 hours? Well, move it to 72 hours. Move it to more than that. How many ever days it takes to make sure that you don't have to strain your team in order to get those requests done. And when you do that, update your vendor policy, get your leadership to sign off on it so that the team members, internal employees know what your turnaround time is, and they know that that has been approved by leadership. One other thing I do want to say is that, you always get those urgent requests. Now more than ever, you really need to follow up with those folks that continue to have those urgent requests. Keep a list, keep a log, and go back and talk to those team members and see what it is they're doing that's resulting in those urgent requests. And a lot of times they just don't really understand what we have to do in accounts payable in the vendor team or procurement in the vendor team, if that's where the vendor setup and maintenance is. They don't really understand what goes into it, so they think they can just send it to us and it can be done ASAP. And we know that's not the case. So you want to make sure that you're following up with those that have those urgent requests, have those discussions so that you can, if not eliminate those urgent requests, then reduce them. All right, so that was number 2. Number 3, and this is the last policy tip, and it's not a vendor policy, it's not even an AP policy. I'm going to talk about the PO policy. So many of you probably have, I'm sure you have a PO policy. They're just not enforced, right? PO compliance is just not there. What I would say, though, is that you have to work with the procurement team and see if you can have a way that you can try to enforce that PO policy and also have more PO vendors, right? So maybe revise that PO policy to require have different requirements or thresholds for when a PO is required. And then that way you get less random vendors being sent your way or your team's way to set them up for different products or services. So the more PO vendors you have, the less random vendors from internal team members, which means the less vendor requests. And I say here too, I know there's always been sort of friction between procurement and AP. It is time to let that go. Work with the procurement team, work with the purchasing team, or the AP team to make sure that you guys are in sync, because they're using the same vendors. Procurement and AP are really using the same vendors, just for different things, different focuses, but it's procurement that really has the relationships with the vendors. And so AP, you never know when you're going to need that relationship to kick in, especially when you're trying to confirm a change to their vendor information if there are some other red flags. So keep that in mind. Go for the PO policy to try to increase the number of PO vendors and then work better with the procurement team. All right, so that was the first 3. There were policy tips. So now let's get into process tips. And how many of these do I have? Of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so the first one, and this one's going to be a little controversial for you, at least in the beginning, but it is that phone call that you make whenever you get a change to a vendor's existing vendor's banking. Eliminate that phone call. Put processes in place so that you don't have to make that phone call. I work with clients to revise their vendor setup and maintenance process. I add in authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. And you can add in authentication of the requester and then require authenticating data like the existing banking information in order to change banking information. And that may be, if you document it, put it in a process, that may be enough that you can go to your leadership or your internal or external auditors and get that phone call eliminated, because you know better than I do that, and I used to be a practitioner, so I had the same issues, but we both know when you try to make that phone call, the vendors aren't waiting for that phone call. They hardly pick up the first time. So you're always making that phone call again and again. And what I have found is that team members just don't like making that phone call because the vendors don't pick up, and it's taking them away from doing other things. And so find a way to eliminate that phone call and save that very manual process. All right, so the next one is to set up a separate vendor team generic mailbox. So I've seen where there are some accounts payable teams. You'll have an accounts payable mailbox and you'll get your invoices in there and you get your vendor changes in there. And so now you've got to have multiple people in the same box or more multiple people in the same email box fishing for all of their emails. Separate the vendor requests, if you're still getting it from your vendor supporting documentation via email. And even if maybe you already have a vendor portal, if you're still getting and responding to vendor requests via email, still separate it. Actually, I do recommend you take that all to the portal, as long as your portal has a messaging function that the vendor can access. But if for whatever reason it's still coming through the mailbox, a generic email box, make sure it's a separate vendor team email box, and then it's a more streamlined process, and whatever is in that mailbox is our vendor request. And it also not necessarily efficiency, but it does add one other piece of fraud mitigation, in that you don't have accounts payable team members or procurement team members looking at the sensitive information that could be contained on that documentation when they don't need to. So you're eliminating the exposure to vendor sensitive information when you're limiting who has access to a mailbox, and you can do that when you split it. All right, so the next one, which is tip number 6. So this is the third one of the process tips and 6th one overall. And that is to make sure you cross-train the vendor team. Even though you may be short a team member or two, and you may think that you don't have time to do the cross-training, you still want to allow either yourself or your team members to be able to take PTO, to be able to take vacations. And, we've all been in those situations where, only one person knows how to do this one thing. And so you need to make sure that you don't get yourself into that scenario, especially because that person could be the next one that leaves. And then what are you going to do? So make sure you cross-train the vendor team to be able to allow vendors, or not vendors, but your employees or team members to take vacations, not only from a mental health point of view, but also it is still a great internal control to mitigate the risk of internal fraud as well. So make sure you cross-train the vendor team. The next one, and this is number 7, another process tip, is to document your desktop procedures. So this goes right along really with cross-training the vendor team. You have to have desktop procedures that will be available for reference for when team members are onboarded. So let's say you do replace that team member or those team members that left, you're going to need something to train them with. And in addition to that, this is a great time if you do not currently have desktop procedures and we're right in the middle of the Great Resignation. If you think people are leaving or maybe even retiring for that matter, make sure you either create or update your desktop procedures to capture the knowledge that may be leaving out of your door before it leaves. So desktop procedures are great to capture the knowledge before it leaves, and then also to train your team members that are new or has a reference for existing team members when they need it, such as when they're cross-training and doing the work of another employee where they are off on vacation or PTO. Another thing I like about desktop procedures, and I talk about it all the time, is the fact that if you have desktop procedures in place, now you have an auditable process. And all of the different authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices that I talk about, the only real way that you're going to get your team members, or you for that matter, right, to consistently employ those processes in the way that they need to be employed in order to mitigate fraud, is to do that that audit at the vendor process level. And desktop procedures allow you to do that. I do have a template desktop procedure. It is actually on a new vendor ad, but you can use it for any type of vendor process. And I will put a link to that in the show notes. So if you're interested in getting a template, then go ahead and check the show notes and follow the link. Now, the last one I have under process tips is number 8, is to post the self-help instructions for adding a vendor or changing a vendor record on your intranet and put a link to your intranet in the signature of every vendor team member. So I talked before under policy tips about adding in your vendor policy, how, the instructions of how to set up a vendor, how to change an existing vendor, and what is required. And you can put that vendor policy out there as well, but have a separate set of instructions, one pager for how to add a vendor, how to change a vendor, how to communicate with accounts payable, and put that out on your intranet so your internal employees have easy access to it. And again, put that link to your intranet into the signature of every vendor team member. And then that way, if employees contact them and ask them how to do something, they can very easily take that link and point them towards the intranet versus trying to copy and paste instructions, which that's not a bad thing either. You can create FAQs and have copy and paste for like your most frequently asked questions, and you can put that in the email. But I find that if you direct internal employees to an intranet to updated instructions, that's a little bit faster than having to go and copy and paste instructions and put them in the email. All right, so that was number 8, and that finished off the process tips. And so now we're going to talk about the last 4, and these are team member tips. So the first one might be a little controversial, but it is let the team members work from home. And I guess I'll put in a little caveat, when able. So it really means be flexible. So if they are already working overtime, and you are one of the organizations that now more of you have to go back into the office, either full-time or a hybrid where you weren't before because of the lifting of the COVID restrictions. If they're already working overtime, now you're adding in their commute time. There's not going to make for a happy combination. Make it optional for those that want to work from home. And I say it that way because I know plenty of folks that actually like going into the office. Nothing's wrong with that. I don't happen to be one of them. Maybe you're not one of them, but there are folks out there, team members out there that really like the camaraderie in the office. It does make it a little bit easier to work when you have folks all in the same place. I don't know if that's where we're going to get back to that again, but there are lots of folks that like to go into the office. So make it optional, especially for those folks that are working overtime because they are absorbing work from someone that has someone or multiple team members that have left. The next one is hire a contractor versus overtime. So I would actually, if it's applicable for you, see if you can take overtime off the list and hire a contractor. I know that this may be one of the least ones that you'll be able to get through because you are hiring folks. It does cost money. You do have to get approval for it. But if you can hire contractors to alleviate the overtime and the subsequent burnout from your employees, that may save, that next employee that's going to leave because they are burnt out. And typically, you probably already know this, is that it's not the folks that are leaving are the ones that can go get another job. So those are probably some of your best folks that are going to be leaving because they're going to be burnt out. And so you want to try to save that and hire contractors versus having them work longer hours. Now, there are some things that you can do to make that process easier as far as process wise. So I know one of the suggestions I have is I know with doing the IRS 10 match, a lot of you may still sign up for the free, irs.gov, e-services, but that can take weeks to go through. And, sometimes you have to go through a contractor or two before you find the right one. So do something else. Find another way to get some of those validations done. I talk about 10check all the time, so it's 10check.com. I even have a training on the fourth Wednesday of every month on how to read those validations. But what that does is it gets you the ability to put someone into place in the vendor request process much quicker because they have a better way, an easier way, a faster way to do those validations. Now, speaking of the IRS 10 match, I just did a podcast. I think it was the last one, episode 176, on 4 different ways to do the IRS 10 match. And so 10check.com was one of them. And then there was another way as well that you may already have. And it was with your 1099 or 1042 software. So check that out because, again, that could get your contractors up and running much quicker than having to register with the IRS and having that take a few weeks. Now, the next one, and this is number 11, so it's the second to the last. It is show appreciation for your team members. So there's a book out there called The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. I read it a few years back, but basically you're finding out with your team members and your colleagues, you're finding out how they like to be appreciated. Now, I know Employee Appreciation Day was last Friday, March 4th. It's always the first Friday in March every year, and it's celebrated by the U.S. and Canada. I know it's gone now, but it's never too late to start expressing appreciation. That is year-round, not just on Employee Appreciation Day or when you're doing a mid-year or a year-end review. So that is episode 175. It's the one right before this one. So check that one out because I talk about the 5 languages of appreciation, what they are. And I also talk about the process that I use to find out what my team members' language of appreciation was. So make sure you check that out. All right. And the last one, number 12, is team meetings. So you want to have regular vendor team meetings. You want to make sure that you're always communicating with your employees, that they have a way to voice when things are wrong, when they have questions, and you can have a weekly or bi-weekly or whatever consistency, just make sure it's consistent, team meeting for your vendor team. On this team member, you could have an agenda, and episode 169, I talk about having vendor team members, vendor team meetings and what those agendas are like, needs to include. And I also talk about that. I have a YouTube channel and I have a Vendor Master File Tip of the Week for vendor team meeting agendas. And I'll put a link to that video. I think it's like 4 minutes long that you can watch to get some recommendations for how to build that agenda. But again, I'll put that in the show notes so you can link right out to it. But have those team meetings. Sometimes all your team members really want, or maybe you feel this too, is to have the ability to communicate and to talk about what's going on, and the team meetings can do that. One of the things I talk about that you can keep on that you should always have a static on the agendas is have a good news professional and good news personal. And so that if you have that on the agenda and you have everyone in the room go around and talk about something good that happened to them professionally, something good that happened to them personally, that will, 1, build trust in your team members, and then 2, it gets everyone talking. And that's really the first thing on the agenda. So it gets everybody talking, it gets everyone into everyone else, and then you go on with the rest of the agenda. So check out episode 69, and then also the link in the show notes for the Vendor Master File Tip of the Week if you want to know more about how to build that vendor team meeting agenda. All right, so I hope those 12 tips for efficiency or adding efficiency helped. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me anytime, or for that matter, any stories about how you're dealing with this. I don't know, unprecedented time. So reach out to me at Deborah@DeborahRRichardson.com. I'll also have my email in the show notes. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 177th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.